Hey everybody, how are we doing today? It is me, Dan, moderately anonymous MTG, and we are here to talk some more theory today. And we are here to talk specifically about what is a card worth, and specifically what is a card worth in your cEDH deck. Why do we play cards? What makes a card make the cut? And how do we determine how powerful a card actually is? Specifically, we're going to be talking about cantrips and cEDH and why you don't see more of them in the cEDH meta. And of course, before we hop into it, I'm going to shout out Wizards of the Coast for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for helping me produce more theory content for cEDH. This is a super cool thing. So if you want to help support the show, help support Wizards making more cEDH content, go and hit up our link down below, pre-order yourself some Wilds of Eldraine product, and thank you so much for supporting the show. Let's dive into it. Cantrips like Ponder, Preordain, and Brainstorm are quintessential parts of the strongest formats in Magic like Legacy and Vintage, so why don't we see more of them in cEDH? Some of cEDH's most popular decks and strategies are modeled directly after Vintage Legacy decks, so why don't cantrips translate to the cEDH format? First, to understand that, let's take a look at why cantrips are important to Legacy and Vintage. Cantrips, in their most basic sense, are cards that replace themselves. Their literal function is to draw cards, but in Legacy, the reason we run a full suite of Brainstorm and Ponders isn't just to draw a single card, they serve a much higher function in these decks. In Legacy, cantrips smooth out mana, they act as additional land slots, they replace themselves, they help to stabilize board presence and make sure that strong cards keep coming when we need them. The basic function of cantrips is to smooth out a long game. One of the most important qualities that I mentioned here is the fact that cantrips act as land slots. If you look at the average control deck in Legacy, you're going to see them running somewhere between 19 and 21 lands. This is a huge difference from control decks in other formats and from control decks from before Ponder's time, because those decks might have been running anywhere from 26 to 28 lands, almost half of their entire deck. The main purpose of running so many lands is to make sure that you're always hitting your land drops. Control decks want to hit their land drops, they want to be able to use their mana effectively and use the most mana possible. Cantrips like Brainstorm and Ponder now come into those slots as a way to act both as the land slots and as card selection. Brainstorm is used to filter the quality of your hand and turn bad cards into good cards. When we cast Brainstorm, we get to draw 3 cards, put them all into our hand, and then choose the worst 2 out of the bunch to put them back on top of our library. Of course, the trick in Legacy is to also use this in combination with a fetch land so that you can crack the fetch, shuffle your library, and shuffle the bad cards away. It can help save you from a Thoughtseize, it can put the cards that aren't as relevant in your matchup back into your deck so you can shuffle them away, and most importantly, it digs 3 cards deep into your library to find exactly what you need. Ponder, while it doesn't let you see as many cards, can be used to help find a more specific card, because it digs 1 card deeper into your deck potentially. Ponder looks at your top 3 cards, and you can rearrange them in any order and then choose to shuffle, potentially showing you a 4th card. But similar to Brainstorm, it can dig as many as 3 or 4 cards deep into your library to try to find a specific one, but it can't help you change the contents of your hand. Preordain is the weakest of the bunch but gives you the most control over where cards go. It only allows you to dig as many as 3 cards deep, but it helps you put at least 2 of those cards where you want them, either on top or on bottom of your library. The reason we don't see as many copies of Preordain in Legacy lists is because of the card economy. It doesn't work quite as strong as Brainstorm or Ponder does at finding you cards that you need and helping to adjust the top of your deck. Basically what it comes down to is that Preordain is less likely to find you the cards that you need, and it's not as powerful as manipulating your deck as the other 2. These reasons are in part why we don't see more cantrips in cEDH. In cEDH, cantrips perform similar functions, but the results are a lot more random. If we're looking for a counter spell, we don't have 4 copies of Force of Will or Dace that we can be looking for off of a single Ponder. Because of the difference in the size and configurations of these decks, it means that the likelihood of finding the specific cards that we need in any given situation with cantrips and cEDH is a lot lower. In a format with 60 cards where you get to run up to 4 copies of a card, our odds of having a cantrip are extremely likely in our opening hand. With essentially 8 copies of a cantrip between 4 copies of Brainstorm and 4 copies of Ponder, we have a 60% chance of seeing at least one of those cards in our opening hand. In cEDH, of course, we lack the density of good 1-mana cantrips to be able to be that consistent with our opening hands. But more importantly, because of the numerical differences in our deck, cards like Brainstorm and Ponder are much less likely to find what we need. In Legacy, when you cast your Brainstorm, you might be looking for some sort of removal spell, like a Prismatic Ending or a Swords to Plowshares. If you have 6 copies of that removal effect in your deck between your 2 playsets, you're going to be a lot more likely to find it. In Legacy, your deck of course starts at only 60 cards, but by the time you're casting your Brainstorm and Ponder, you're probably about 10 cards deep into your library between your opening hand and your cards that you're casting. That means when you cast your Brainstorm, every one of those 3 cards off the top of your library has a more than 10% chance of being a removal effect. In cEDH, because we're singleton format and because we have 99 cards in our deck, those numbers are vastly skewed. In cEDH, cantrips like Ponder and Preordain no longer provide the efficiency that they provide in Legacy because of these numbers. Another difference in why we don't see cantrips in cEDH is the speed of the respective format. Again, to think about Legacy, let's look at the optimal use of the card Brainstorm. Brainstorm draws 3 cards, puts them into your hand, and then you take your 2 worst cards and put them back on top of your library like we said before. And while your bad cards aren't in your hand anymore, they haven't gone anywhere. They're still on top of your library, and we're going to need to draw through them if we're going to continue to draw in this game. That means Brainstorm, a 1-mana spell, is essentially best used on your second turn of the game. But in cEDH, the first couple turns of the game tend to be far more explosive than they are in Legacy because of the density of fast mana that we have in the format. If we're waiting until turn 2 to cast Brainstorm the most effective way that we possibly can, we're going to put ourselves way behind the rest of the table that's playing out cards like Chrome Mox, Mox Opal, Mana Crypt, etc. One of the problems that Cantrips help solve in Legacy is looking for your mana. But in cEDH, that problem is mostly solved by our mulligan rules and the kinds of cards that are legal in our format. With cards like Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, Jeweled Lotus, and even Lion's Eye Diamond at our disposal, we don't need to look for the consistency of lands as much as we want to look for the explosive nature of mana rocks. It's not a secret that a card like Sol Ring puts you ahead in a game, but one of the ways that Sol Ring helps put you ahead in the game that isn't talked about as frequently is the fact that Sol Ring is also card advantage as well as being mana advantage. In a game where if we play by the rules we only get to play 1 land per turn, Sol Ring puts you ahead essentially 2 turns from your opponents. If they don't also have a Sol Ring or equivalent fast mana, they're going to have to wait until their 3rd turn to play their 3rd land and still be 2 turns behind you if you've made all your land drops. In a world where mana is so explosive and so powerful, it's not as essential to find your individual land drops as it is to find your explosive mana. Part of the problem that Cantrips help solve in Legacy is solved before cEDH games even start. While Cantrips have a primary use for Legacy decks for finding their lands, smoothing out their draws, and providing a game plan, Commander's free mulligan rule combined with the London mulligan means that cEDH players are looking at more cards while taking mulligans. This is where a lot of the power of Cantrips is made up for in smoothing out our draw. It's no secret that cEDH players are willing to mulligan down to 5, 4, or even 3 to find their perfect hand. And the reason that we can do that is because cards like Sol Ring are not only providing mana, but they're also providing card advantage in the fact that they're replacing land drops that we might need to make later in the game. The other part of this equation is the kinds of card advantage spells that we like to play in cEDH and the reason for them. The problem with Cantrips in cEDH is that they provide card selection where what we really want is card advantage. 1v1 Magic is a game of back and forth and resource management. Commander, on the other hand, and in particular cEDH, is much more along the lines of a 3v1 format. Your resources are always going to be outpaced by your 3 opponents. Spending mana and a card to try to find a card that you need at random is a lot worse than setting up engines Ad Nauseam, the One Ring, or Rhystic Study that are going to help you draw the cards that you need and extra cards to help you win the game. Fighting a stack war in cEDH means that you don't just need a singular counterspell to try to defeat your opponent or keep them off of their game plan, it means that you might need as many as 3 or 4. When we think about the inherent card disadvantage of cEDH, it's very easy to see why a density of cards is much more important than having one specific one. Demonic Tutor is a great card and one that you see in every black cEDH deck, but when you see someone cast it, they're much more likely to try to find something like a Rhystic Study or an Ad Nauseam, one of our card advantage engines, than they are to find something like Thassa's Oracle or a Wing Condition. Speaking of the idea of a density of cards versus specific cards, another cantrip problem that cEDH inherently solves is that most decks tend to run card advantage in their command zone. Imagine yourself playing your first turn in a cEDH game. You play a land and a Sol Ring and pass your turn. Your opponent who's on a Tymna deck does the same. You untap for your second turn, play your fetch land, and cast your Brainstorm in your main phase to get optimal card selection from it by shuffling afterwards. Maybe you found a relevant piece of your plan, maybe you found interaction, or maybe just another piece of ramp. Your Tymna opponent takes their turn, plays their second land, and then plays Tymna and also passes. You cast a cantrip, potentially altered the contents of your hand, and maybe gotten some relevant card selection out of it. But while you spent fewer mana than your opponent is spending their mana much more efficiently. Over the course of an average cEDH game, which tends to last around 5 turns, your Tymna opponent could be drawing as many as 9 cards over the course of the next 3 turns. This obviously vastly outpaces the economy of your cantrip. And most importantly, this has cost you a card out of your hand where your opponent has simply played one from the command zone. While you get the immediate selection of cards that you may or may not be able to cast, your opponent has essentially spent no cards because their commander doesn't come out of their hand. They've added pressure to life totals on the board, as well as added a blocker, and now they're also representing more free spells like Fierce Guardianship, Deadly Rollick, or Deflecting Swat. So not only is your opponent getting literal card advantage by being able to draw them with Tymna's ability, but they're also getting pseudo card advantage by now representing more spells in their hand. In the same time it's taken for us to cast a Brainstorm to its full potential, our opponent has added to their board state, represented more interaction than we have, and they're prepared to vastly outpace our burst of 3 random draws. This highlights one of the most important facts about commanders and the command zone. In cEDH, we see a very strong trend towards commanders that provide card advantage in the command zone like Tymna, Thrasios, Prom, and Tibet. While it's not essential for commanders to provide card advantage, the best ones always do. Whether that's literal card advantage by putting them into your hand, or pseudo card advantage like with Najeela who creates more warrior tokens on her own. The best decks aren't just piles of the best cards thrown together. The best decks have synergistic effects, and most importantly, each slot should be carefully picked to support the overall game plan. Cantrips don't generally help an overall game plan. The problem of smoothing mana is mostly solved by mulligans and access to cards like Mana Crypt and Sol Ring. The problem of smoothing out our draws is mostly solved by card advantage via your command zone, so for the average deck, there's not a great reason to want to run cantrips. Of course, there will always be decks like Krark and Sakashima, or low color blue decks that simply need more cards to add to their pool, that are going to want cantrip spells like Brainstorm and Ponder, but the most powerful decks in cEDH have already fixed the problem that those cards solve. Card advantage is one of the most important aspects of the game of Magic, and a pretty clear indicator in most games of who has the most powerful board presence. So it might be odd to see the most powerful decks in the most powerful format not using some of the best tools that Legacy and Vintage decks have at their disposal. But the most important thing to learn here is that context is everything. The reason that we don't see these cantrips in cEDH is because our decks serve different functions, they leverage different abilities and different powerful spells, and our slight difference in mulligan rules means that the context of these cards are different. In the same way that the economy of a card like Rhystic Study is much different for Legacy than it is for cEDH, the economy of cantrips is much different for cEDH than it is for Legacy. Cantrips in these formats are designed to serve a much different function. Alright y'all, this has been a talk about cantrips, and of course we're not specifically saying never run a cantrip, or that cantrips aren't good enough for cEDH. Context is always going to be king, but I hope this helps you understand how the context is different in these different formats. We always want to borrow from the best cards and the best strategies, but they don't always directly translate, and it's really important to think about the functions that these cards serve and how we're differentiating them. cEDH and constructed formats have very different purposes, very different functions, and very different dynamics having more and fewer opponents. So the next time you're tinkering with your deck, you're thinking about those different card slots, make sure you're thinking about the functions that these card slots serve and how they're either supporting or not supporting your overall game plan. Thank you all so much for watching, and one more shout out to Wizards for helping me sponsor this video. If you want to see WotC sponsor more awesome cEDH content like this, make sure you go use our referral link right down in the description of this video. Go pick yourself up some Wilds of Eldraine card, and let me know in the comments how good Beseech the Mirror is. We'll see you next time, everybody. Be good to yourselves.